First off, I wanted to dedicate the Shiur alias Neshama, elevation of the soul of Arini Molko, Regina Bas Yosef Reuven, and it should certainly elevate her in Gan Eden. Now, I've been talking extensively, obviously, about not just Pesach, but how Pesach is really the model of the whole tikkun process. And I think this is number 6. I'm not sure, but so on. So I want to try to conclude this, in terms of what the tikkun process really is, the rectification process, And truth is, if somebody studies this very well, you really understand the basic, fundamental story, if you want to use that word, of what Judaism is and what it wants to accomplish, and really where it really wants to take the Jewish people and even the entire world. So I'm going to again talk about ideas, but I'm going to try to answer really a very fundamental question, and that is, from the last year, we saw that even the Torah, that the Jews restored the Zohama because of the sin of the golden calf. And that's what we see, In any case, so not only was it restored, but I also mentioned that the Torah itself is now surrounded by the Zohama, you see. And I went into that quite extensively and so on, So the question then is, okay, so what do we do? How do we really remove the Zohama? I mean, they clearly did it in Egypt. So how are we going to do it, now, in 2022? But there's no question, as I've spoken repeatedly, really for a long time, that we see that the world today is much worse than it was even, 30 years ago. There's a substantial amount of evil, that is happening in the world. And what's interesting is that evil is being recognized as being terrible. Not all of it, obviously, but there is a recognition. So hopefully it means, like I said, that the window is about to close. So we have to be very, very close. And you remember what I said about the Zohar, that the Zohar says that 210 years before the end, which is 2240, right? 2240, and we are about, 218 years before the end, that Tchias HaMesim will occur. Tchias HaMesim obviously occurs after Mashiach ben David comes, right? So that's the year 2030, and that's less than 80 years from now. And that's probably why you see such a tremendous acceleration of what is going on. So there's no question that as we watch the acceleration process, and that's really what it is, that's why in the last 20 years there is so much things, so many events that have happened. Because what God is doing is He's speeding up the acceleration process. And if the Mashiach ben David arrives, by 2030, which is what the Zohar seems to be implying, then there's an enormous amount that has to be accomplished in order for that to happen. You see, and that's why we are seeing such a tremendous rapidity of the events occurring. One after the other. Every day you wake up, it's like something new is happening, which is astounding. So there's no question that we are getting closer and closer. In any case, the question is, so what happens now, since the Zohama, the pollution or the contamination of the Bria, of the creation, has now reasserted itself. So what do we do now? And that's what I wanted to, speak about. And what does it have to do with the holiday of Pesach and the Mitzvos of Pesach? Now, in order to understand really, many times, in order to understand a concept, that concept itself needs an introduction. It's called background information. So in order to understand these ideas, you need some background information. And one of the things that is very important is what exactly is the result of the Zohama. You see, what exactly happens? So what we can see is the following. Adam Harishon, the first man, there was the Nochash, the snake, but I had mentioned that the snake was external. He was outside the body of Adam, the first man, you see. In other words, Adam Harishon, his world, which was Gan Eden, did not have the Zohama. It had Geshem. It had a certain degree of physicality, but it had no Zohama intertwined with it. Now, I've spoken about this before, you see. So obviously it was a very different kind of world, you see. In other words, Zohama existed, the possibility of that force existed that could intermingle with Geshem, physical world, right, in potential. But that was not the world that Adam resided in. So what was the problem with Adam? Now, what man, in order to allow him to have a test, has to suffer under a certain delusion or false belief. And that's because an Adam, a man, does not see reality completely. So he exists with certain beliefs about what the world really is, the true nature. So what was the belief of Adam before he did the sin? Well, the belief of Adam is what? Is that he is a self, right? And but he's not a cause. He can't do anything really. He was born, or rather created, I should say, on the sixth day. So when he was conscious of himself, he felt a certain sense of self, but he knew he didn't make any of this. He knew it was God, you see. So therefore, he did not have any kind of false belief or delusion that he was a cause of anything, really. He just came into the world, and there he is, conscious of everything, but not really in any way knowing that he had any input in this. He's not a cause of anything, you see. But the problem with Adam is that he thought he could become a cause, you see. And that's where the Nachash, the snake, the primordial snake, who was the mouthpiece of the Satan, tried to introduce him and his wife Chava. That no, you could become like God. And this is exactly what the test was. Because they said that God himself became God, the ability to create worlds, the ability to do, the shlita, the domination of the world, cause, right, is because he ate from that tree. Now, he doesn't want you to rival him, so that's why he commanded you not to eat from that tree, you see. And therefore, Adam and Chava had the belief that they could become like God, and that's what the Nocha said. V'yisim kelukim, and you would be as God. That is exactly what it says in the Chumash. Well, that was obviously very enticing, you see, because they had a belief that there was somebody, they had a self, but no, they were infinitely inferior to God in the sense that they can't do anything. They're not a cause of anything, you see. and therefore they ate from the tree. Now, when they ate from the tree, what happened? Then they fell, if you want to use that expression, they fell into a different world. They fell into the world of the Zohama, or the satanic world. Now, we don't know exactly what the process was, but their world changed, you see. The pollution of the Satan surrounded them, and it surrounded, the world, so they were chased out of Gan Eden into a world that was dominated by the Satan, you see. But in that world, because they had failed, so God said to Adam, very incredible concept, he says, in the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Now to us, the Ramchal, Ramosha Chaim Luzzatto, tells us what that means in a profound way. It's not like people think, well, in the sweat of your brow you'll eat bread, which means you're going to have to really work hard, and that is a punishment, that you're going to have to exert tremendous amount of labor to be able to make a livelihood. That's what eating bread means. And therefore that is a punishment. Until now you were in Gan Eden, and everything was there for you. You had to do absolutely nothing to do whatever you want, eat. It was all there for you. So God said, no, in the sweat of your brow you will eat. What does that mean? It's not that God is punishing him. What God is doing, since you believed, right, that you can equal me, it's not only are you a self, but you a self that is able to cause. And like Rashi says, Borei Olamos, create worlds. Then that delusion or false belief, I am going to create a situation, right, since you had that belief, or you thought you could become equal to me, I'm going to create a situation or put you in a situation where it will be much more difficult to see, you see, that you can't cause anything. How? Because what will happen is that in order for you to make a livelihood, which means, let's say, to eat bread, you need to exert tremendous amount of labor, as exhibited by sweat. On the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Well, if that's the case, since you have to exert tremendous amount of effort, you're going to think that you're a cause. You see? You're going to think that you are responsible for the livelihood. Why? Because it can only come as a result of your efforts. But that itself is a false delusion. Because in the end, no matter what you do, I am the one, God says, who in the end gives you your bread, your livelihood. But since it only comes when you exert force, labor, then you're going to fall in the mistaken delusion, right, that you caused it. And therefore your work is now to undo that delusion and realize that even though it looks like the only way you will have a parnasa, eat bread, is by your own efforts, and therefore it looks like you caused it, you're going to have to undo or work through that belief and realize that it is false. So what God did is he increased the difficulty of undoing the false belief, you see. So not only would Adam not, because like I said, what this would mean is that not only Adam thinks that he is a self, but he's a self that causes, you see, just like God. And he's going to have to undo that false belief. So what it means is that if he undoes it, which means he realizes he's not a cause for anything, then the next thing he has to believe is that God is the only thing that exists, that Adam is not even a self. So we realize that there are two ideas. One is Yichud Mitziusoi, that God is the only thing that exists. Everything else does not exist in the way God does. So that's the first idea of reality, true reality. The second idea of true reality is that since God is the only thing that exists, He's the only one that can do anything, that can cause anything, you see. And both of these ideas is what Adam should have worked through, you see. Because before he ate from the tree, he realized that he's not a cause, but he thought he exists as a self besides God. So his error was not in reaching the idea that God is the only one that exists. Einod milvadoi. Besides God, there's nothing else. So obviously he never reached that truth, right? But what he did is he made the second idea, that he's not a cause, much more difficult to achieve. Because now he would only be able to make a parnasa if he actually labored, which fools him into thinking that he is the cause, you see. These are very important ideas, because what they do is they illustrate or they indicate what the real test of man is, to understand these two false beliefs, that A, you're not even a cause, and B, you're not even a self. And Adam Rishon should have realized, right, the idea that he's not even a self, but he didn't. And now Adam has to realize, because he creates parnasa, livelihood only through his effort, now he has to come to the realization that he's not a cause at all. You see, he's fooled. So what God did, he didn't punish him. He made it worse, or much more difficult, to come to the truth of what the nature of man really is. You see. So these are very important ideas, you see. And what causes a person to think that he is also a true cause, right, is the Zohama. Because in the world of the Zohama, things can only happen if you exert effort, you see. So in the world of Gan Eden, things happen without exerting effort. But in the world of the Zohama, things will only happen if you exert effort, because what that does is it fools you into thinking that you are a real cause. When you think about that, it's a very fundamental flaw in the belief of man. But we are now stuck at that second level of illusion, if you want to use that word, you know. That's why one of the interesting things about all this is that really we do nothing. We believe we are causes, but in the end we really do nothing. So one of the most fundamental, or maybe it is the most fundamental, actually it's not, the most fundamental psychological drive in a human being, of all the different psychological drives and needs, do you know what that is? It's the drive for self-preservation, that you want to protect your existence, your life, at all costs. Self-preservation is the most fundamental human drive, psychological drive. But do you know what the second most important psychological drive is? It answers a tremendous amount of questions. And in the end, it's the basis of all psychological maladies and trauma. But I'm not going to go into that. Actually, I gave a whole bunch of shiurim about that a long time ago. But in any case, the second most fundamental drive, psychological drive of a human, is very much related to this. It's where we are always trying to assert, reassure ourselves that we are somebody, right? That we are not a nobody. You don't realize that everything you do always has either the direct motive or the indirect motive of asserting being. Very important idea, because in the end we are really nothing. So we always have to convince ourselves that we are somebody. In fact, what's interesting is that you actually see this in the Torah, you know, and I'm going to read what it says. Okay? And you will eat v'yochalta. This is in Parshas Ekev, right? In Sheni. And the Torah reveals a very fundamental idea about the inherent nature of man. Really, it's about the second most basic psychological drive, and that is mankind is always trying to reassure himself that he is somebody, to assert being. You see, to have a sense of self-regard, self-worth. So, because it says v'yochalta, and you will eat, and you will v'savoto, and you will be satisfied, right? And you will bless the Lord your God on the land, which I gave you. Now here's where the Torah reveals an incredible secret. Hishomer lecha, watch out. Pentishkach es Hashem Elokecha, lest you forget the Lord your God. To do what? In what way will you forget him? The vilti shemo mitzvosov, not to observe his commandments. That's the equivalent of forgetting God. Umishpatov, and his ordinances, and so on, that I am commanded you. That's what God says. Watch it. Don't forget me, and the way you forget me or indicate that is you won't observe my commandments. What will bring you to forget my commandments? So the Torah mentions 4 different situations. 1, pentoichal v'savoto, lest you eat and you be satisfied. That's the way number 1. So you're eating and satisfying yourself with eating. Let's say you eat a great meal, right? You will forget God. Then the second way, ubotam toivim tivne v'yoshavto, and you're going to build beautiful houses, right, and dwell in it. That's a second way that situation can cause you to forget God. The third way, ubekolcho v'tzoincho, and your flock and sheep and so on, right? Yerivun, you will multiply. You're going to own a tremendous amount of livestock. And then the fourth way, the kesef v'zov yarbeloch, and money, gold and silver, you're going to increase, right? You're going to increase. So these are the and everything and everything that is yours, yirba, you will increase. Okay, so these 4 ways, right? But why these 4 ways? And I'll tell you something very interesting. Because these 4 ways is the way man convinces himself that he is somebody. Yeah, it's incredible. Let's go over that again. Lest you eat and be satisfied. See, what we don't realize is everything we exercise our will. Whenever we do something that we want to do, which I exercise my will, right? Immediately, the underlying feeling is I am somebody. Because if I was a nobody, how can I have a will? How can I have pleasure exercising that will? So to exercise one's will and do it is a way of feeling that I'm a somebody. So the Torah uses that by you will eat and be satisfied. The second way we exercise our being or convince ourselves that we're somebody is what's called productivity. When we produce something, when we cause something to happen, then we feel as if we exist. So we feel like a somebody. So the Torah illustrates that with, and good houses you will build and you will dwell in it. Well, that's productivity. In other words, right? You're going to build. You're going to be productive. And therefore you will be convinced, well, the house is coming into being because, right, I am causing it. That tells you that I am a somebody. So that's a second way that we can convince ourselves that we are somebody. And then it says, and your flock and sheep you will multiply. What way is that? Possessions. Why does everybody want to own everything? Because one of the pleasures of ownership is not just to derive the function of that which you own. No, it's also because I possess. And when you possess something, what does that mean? It means you can control that device. And control gives you a sense of self. Right, you see? And that's why everybody wants to possess, you see, because that gives them a sense of control. And if I can control others, clearly I must exist. So that's a third way of asserting being. And the fourth way that the Torah says, the kesef resolve, and gold and silver you will increase. Why? Because what does money do? Money in itself is not something you can function with. It doesn't do anything for you. But money, gold, silver, whatever, these are items that make you potent. They give you the ability to do anything. It's like, if you have a tremendous amount of money, guess what? You can do almost anything that's possible, because that's what money does. It allows you to achieve almost anything by buying it or whatever, owning it and so on. So that's the fourth way of asserting being. If you have millions and millions of dollars, of course you're going to become what? You will think you are somebody. In other words, all of this concept of being somebody is nothing more than incredible arrogance, you see. Now, these are the four ways that the Torah uses as examples that you are going to assert being, reassure, reconfirm being, right? So what will happen to you, right? Well, the gist was you're going to forget God. But look what the Torah says. What will happen? V'rom levavecha, and your heart will grow mighty. There you are. That's the arrogance. You will now convince yourself that I am a somebody. I am self-worth. And therefore, if you are a somebody, you will therefore forget the Lord your God that has taken you out of Egypt from the house of slaves. You see? And therefore, Torah says, and we skip a pasuk, and you will say in your heart, and you will say in your heart, that my strength and the might of my hand did this for me. That's what you're going to say. You see, all of this came about. Why? I did these four things. They all confirm that I am somebody. My heart will grow tremendously haughty, and therefore, why do I have to do what God wants? I will do what I want because I exist independent of God. Why? What's the proof? Because my strength has caused all of this. It's incredible. The Torah is actually telling you, right, what's going to happen in these four situations. But what the Torah is also providing you is the second greatest psychological drive of a human. The first, I said, is to, self-preservation, is to do anything that will cause you to exist, right, not die. And the second is I need to confirm, to assert that I am somebody, you see, that I am a true self, you see. And the way you do it is the four ways the Torah said. You either exercise your will, and that itself will make you feel like somebody, right? And then you become productive, you see, you create, so that will do it. Then possessions will do it, because if I have possessions, then I can control others, right? And then gold and silver, because if I have a lot of money, of course, I'm it. I can do anything I want. You see what the Torah does, which is amazing when you think about that, you see. And this then is what God said to Adam, in the sweat of your brow you will eat bread, because I am now putting you in a situation outside of Gan Eden where you are going to, it'll be much more difficult for you to erase the falseness that you are a true cause, you see. And because you have not erased that, you think you are a cause, you are in a delusion of false belief. And you are voida, your task now becomes much more difficult, you see. Very, very basic, very important information, you see. And all of this is the responsibility, what causes us, because of the Zohama, you see. Because if we were in Gan Eden, we wouldn't have the delusion that we are a cause. We would have a delusion that besides God, there's also us. But we would never think that we are equal to God. In the world without Zohama, in the world of just Geshem, physicality, Well, physicality is a barrier, you see, because it separates me from God. So therefore there's God and there's me. But in no way can I believe that I equal God in any way, in potency, in the ability to do. But when you enter the world of Zohama, which is not just physicality, but it's a physicality intermingled with the pollution of the Satan, then it's a second barrier, you see, and we begin to enter that world of what he enters, you see, and that is where we think that we are not only a self besides God, but that we are equal to God in the sense that we produce. Very basic thing. And by the way, I'm not going to go into it. It's a whole other lecture. But this second psychological understanding, drive, where man is always asserting himself that he is. Self-worth is the fundamental psychological drive, really is the underlying idea that when you lack that, that is the underlying idea of all psychological illness. It's a whole shiur in itself. But that's what it is. Everybody who psychologically has defense mechanisms suffers from an inferiority complex, no matter what that is. And then he has to protect himself with defense mechanisms, right? And give himself the feeling that he's a somebody. In any case, it's very basic. So, this is what we now see. That Zohama causes us, because it's a second barrier. Besides the physical world, there's also, right, the world of the Zohama in the physical world, and that causes us to believe, since we have to expend effort in order to get things done, it causes us the false belief that we are a cause, and therefore we are equal to God. Very interesting idea. And in many ways, that's what the Torah is, you see. So after the Jews reintroduced the Zohama into creation by doing the golden calf, right, the problem was, how are we going to get rid of this, you see? What happens now? And therefore, the first way, if we would have had the Luchos Rishonos, the first tablets, right, which is what Moshe Rabbeinu brought down and that he broke it, right? So that way, that's the messianic light. That's the Nun Shari Bina, the 50 gates of wisdom. So that automatically would have removed the second delusion that we can cause anything, and it would even have given us the knowledge of the first delusion, that we exist independent of God, you see, which is interesting, because in the Messianic era, we do not experience Einod Milvadoi. We know it. And maybe we experience it in a very light way. The real place we experience Einod Milvadoi besides God, there is nothing else. It's not in the Messianic era to experience it. We experience it in Olam Haba, the future world. That's where the full exposure to the falseness that we think we are a self independent of God, or that we even exist like God, is completely broken in the future world. But the first luchos, the first tablets, right, would have had that also. So if we had received the first tablets, right, because the Jews, remember, they had externalized the Zohama, so they were worthy of the first tablets. They would have broken and seen as false both of these false ideas, delusions. But now that the Jews reintroduced that belief, these two beliefs, because of the world of the Zohama, right? Again, we went into that world. Then we now have those false delusions. So how do we break it? So therefore the Torah gave us, or God gave us, the second luchos. Now the second luchos, the second tablets, are what? They are the tablets that have mitzvahs. It's a concept of the avodah. We now have to do mitzvahs, you see. And when you do a mitzvah, automatically, right, you are doing the will of God. You are negating your will for the will of God. And when you do that, then you distinctly get the feeling, of course, that God's will is supreme, right? And therefore you begin to realize that is the beginning of the diminishment of self. So the second tablets is a way where you can actually intervene in the world of the Zohama and try to break the delusions that the Zohama causes. You see, so that's what Torah really does. Torah is the only device that can make you or cause you to break the delusion of self. And not only the delusion of self, but the delusion of what type of self you are, that you are a true cause. Because it forces you 613 ways to do the will of God. And all those ways are against basically what you want to do. You know, let's say you want to eat, right? And you pass a restaurant that is not kosher. So you want to eat because you're very hungry, right? But you say, no, I cannot eat that because God said I cannot eat food that is not kosher. So what are you really doing? You are denying yourself your will, and you are adhering to the will of God. That automatically diminishes your sense of self, or your sense of the delusion of who you really are. And you are asserting that God's will is supreme. But why? Because God really is the only thing that exists. You see? So the mitzvah, as the Gemara says, is a tavlin. The mitzvah is an antidote, right, to the delusions of self. That's why Torah is the only device that can do that. There is no other device. So even the second tablets, which they got, even after they introduced the Zohama into the creation, is critical to diminish the concept of self. You see, because once you do that, then you are on your way to understand the real idea, right? The real idea that even if you feel yourself, you do not cause anything. And the second thing is ultimately that when you deny your will, you are denying the concept, right, of who you are, the importance of who you are. In many ways, you are denying that you are nothing. It's only God that is. And that's why His will is supreme. Very important ideas. So even the second luchos, the second tablets that God gave, is the only way to break that delusion of self. And remember, the concepts of self that you are and that you cause, those are behind, or that's caused by the Zohama, you see. Because we have to interact with the world in order to get anything done. So it's always easy to make the mistake that our input is what caused it. That's the mistake we're always making. And that is the world of the Zohama, you see. So the first way of getting rid of Zohama, right, is to exercise, right, to do the God's will by doing the mitzvos, as I just said, because that diminishes the sense of self, which is very important. You see, another way, and it's a very important concept, is the concept of suffering. Why does suffering, why is that a tikkun? Why is that a kapora? Why is that an atonement device? Because when a person is in the ICU, for instance, right, the intensive ward, right, and he's plugged into all the tubes and the machines, what do you think he feels about himself? That he's a nobody. Because if you really were a cause, if you really were a somebody, why not pull out everything and just walk out? But he knows he can't. So when a person suffers, he is undergoing something that he cannot end. That proves to him that he's a nobody. You see, that breaks the delusion of self. That's the secret of suffering. And you should know that's a tremendous chesed, kindness that God did. Because He gave us a way, even in the world of Zohama, He gave us a way to diminish the sense of self and to be on the way to understand that I am nothing and God is everything. But first you have to diminish the sense of self, because if not, you'll never let God in. So what suffering does, and that's the secret of how it's able to atone, is it diminishes the sense of self because you can't stop it. You see? So you realize that I am not who I think I am, And therefore, what happens now is there's a real possibility that who is the only force or cause, and that helps you in the direction that it's only God. Very important ideas. That's what suffering does. And that's why suffering is an undoing of a sin, because a sin is something that you do with your will, and therefore that aggravates the feeling that you're somebody. Because that's what, when you sin, you feel like somebody, because you're exercising your will. So suffering is an undoing of the aggrandizement of self, you see. And besides, when you suffer, it's also a reversal of the pleasure that you had as a result of the sin. So those are the two things that suffering brings. Suffering in any form, it doesn't make a difference what form it is. Exile is suffering, bankruptcy, divorce, sickness. You see, all of these things are suffering. So the pain that you feel undoes the pleasure of a sin, so that's a reversal. And the second thing is the diminishment of self also undoes, the delusion of self that you get when you sin. That is the secret of suffering, which is a big chesed, because without that, how would we be able to undo this whole concept of self? Now, besides that, there's something else. How did the Jews bring the Tikun? How did they get rid of the Zohama? And the answer is because they were in Egypt, and they were able to withstand a certain amount of the assimilation, or they suffered for many years, you see. So what God did, that's called the primary tikkun device. So the primary way they got rid of the Zohama, right, is through the exile in Egypt. You see, that's how they did it. So the historical event itself is called the primary tikkun device. But when they failed because of the sin of the golden calf, God said the following, that if you replicate, duplicate, copy, right, some of the symbolic ideas of Egypt itself, I will count that to you as a recognition, right, of the tikkun that was done in those days, and every time you do that, it will remove some of the Zohama. And now you begin to understand the concept of the mitzvos of Pesach. Because what you're doing is called a secondary tikkun device, you see. By doing the mitzvos, which are symbolic of the event called the exile in Egypt, then what happens is that doing those mitzvahs itself will remove the Zohama, because they are an admission, an acknowledgement, you see, of what happened in Egypt, you see, and therefore that itself will reduce the Zohama. And when enough Pesachs go by, that will mean that we will actually have removed the Zohama. One of the main ideas is by Pesach. Now, let's take a look at some of the mitzvahs. First idea is matzah, right? We are commanded to eat matzah. Well, think about that. Matzah is flour and water. There's no leaven or yeast. And that's really what the human body is without Zohama. The body is the physical body, right? And also the neshama, the soul. Well, matzah is also the flour, which is the body, and the water, which represents the neshama. So matzah really is a food which is appropriate to a person that has no Zohama. You see, it has only two ideas, right? And the body has two ideas, right? You see, so matzah actually represents the body, right? The physical body and the soul. Matzah represent that because it's only flour and water. It has no yeast, and the body has no Zohama. Both of them have two elements. So therefore, matzah is the food appropriate for a body without Zohama. Chometz has three elements. Chometz is flour, water, right, and leaven, right? That represents a body that has a physical body, it has a neshama, and it also has the Zohama. You see? So God said you cannot eat chometz in Pesach because that represents you with Zohama, symbolically. You have to eat matzah, which represents you without Zohama. That's why we are commanded to avoid chometz and also to eat the matzah. Now, the third thing we are commanded is moror, that you have to do what? You have to eat bitter herbs. Why? Because the major tikkun device was through suffering in Egypt. Therefore, we eat moror as a reminder that we suffered in Egypt. You see. Then we have the 4 cups, 4 curses. We drink 4 cups of wine. Why? Because when the Jews were redeemed from Egypt, they were redeemed from the 4 levels of the Zohama. If you remember, in the first Shiur, I mentioned that there are 4, that the Zohama can express himself in 4 different environments. And when the Jews left Egypt, and they left the Zohama, then we have 4 cups that celebrate our exit or our release of these 4 levels of Zohama. If you remember what they are, which was what I said in the first lecture. It's a world either environment 1 where there is good and evil. Environment 2 is only basically evil. Environment 3 where evil itself is actually a whole philosophical understanding of Weltanschauung itself. And the 4th level is where that evil understanding of an alternative reality is spread throughout the world. So when the Jews left Egypt, they left all 4 environments of evil, you see. Therefore, we drink 4 cups of wine. Why? What about the 5th cup that we don't drink? That's called the Kos of Eliyahu, because even though we achieved removing the Zohama from us, but that only removes the Zohama. What about the Geshem, the physical body, We're supposed to remove Geshem and become spiritual, So we didn't do that. We only removed the Zohama, but we didn't become from physical to spiritual. And the truth is that's exactly what Eliyahu did. That's why it's called the cup of Eliyahu, because Eliyahu he did not die, because what he was able to do is remove the Zohama, and he went up with his body, you see. So therefore, we use the 5th cup as a Kos of Eliyahu, you see. Now, I mentioned also that the concept of the Yam Suf, is a concept of the reversal of Noach. Because what happened was, like I mentioned then, is that the waters of the Mabel were really the Zohama in that sense, or that destroyed the world. But since the Jews removed the Zohama, or potentially, during the 50 days of counting, 49 days of counting, therefore they went through the Yam split for them, because they had succeeded in removing the Zohama, you see. So we begin to see that these mitzvahs actually mirror symbolically the event of Pesach. Now we also have the concept of the Korban Pesach, where a group of people would get together and register, and they would eat a sacrifice called the Korban Pesach. What was that about? Well, the Korban Pesach, because when you remove Zohama, it's not enough to do that, you see, because what the Jews became is a nation unto themselves, you see. And the Korban Pesach, in many ways, is a membership ritual. Where all of a sudden the Jews ate the Korban Pesach, which is an offering to God, and therefore that initiated them into the service of God, you see. That's why the Korban Pesach is so important, you see, because it initiates a person into being a member of the Jewish people, which is what happened after they left Egypt. They became a true nation. And by the way, that's why also there are two mitzvos aseh, 2 positive commandments that if you don't observe, you get kores, extinction, you see, which means you die before the age of 60. One of them is milah, and that's a membership symbol, that you're a member of the Jewish people. And the second thing is the Korban Pesach, because that was the membership. You already removed the Zohama, you now become a nation without Zohama, or a nation that serves God. So you must eat the Korban Pesach, you see. And that also is why that's the only mitzvah that has a makeup. Because that mitzvah is so important of eating the Korban Pesach that there were people who could not eat the Pesach because they were tamei. So they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, why should we be denied eating a Korban Pesach? So Moshe Rabbeinu then gave the mitzvah, God gave him the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni. What was so important about Pesach Sheni? Why did they need a makeup? Okay, you missed it. Okay. You had a good reason. You were tamei. You were impure. But the answer is that this is a mitzvah that indicates that they are part of the Jewish nation. It's not just a mitzvah. And they didn't want to be exempt from that. You see, it's not just a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that illustrates that they're part of the Jewish nation because that was the reason why they did it in Egypt, to indicate that they are now leaving the tumah of Egypt and they are joining God in his service as part of the Jewish nation. And therefore these people wanted to have that, so they asked Moshe Rabbeinu for a makeup. And he said, okay. And he promulgated the mitzvah, right, which God told him right then and there, of Pesach Sheni. You see? That's why, and so on. So what is interesting is that when we do a Seder, and a Seder, which we do, right, a Seder is a platform that allows us to do these mitzvahs, right, of matzah and moro, and symbolically what represents the Pesach, and so on. They enable us to do this, you see. So when the Jews observe Pesach for thousands of years, every time they observe these mitzvahs of Pesach, right, that diminishes a certain portion of the Zohama, you see, which is really very important. In fact, at the time of Pesach, that time period is when the Zohama becomes erasable, which is interesting. So when the Jews observe Pesach, that's what happens. In fact, if you think about it, if you look at the Jewish people today, and you look at people who do not observe mitzvahs, you will find, which is very interesting, that there's two mitzvahs that they all tend to observe, basically. One is Milah. Even a non-Orthodox Jew wants to have a bris. I mean, there are thousands of stories of Jews that were not religious, but they wanted to have their children have a bris, because that's part of the membership of being a Jew. And the second thing is, everybody makes a Seder. You know, unfortunately, they may have chometz together with the matzah, you see, because they're not observant. But for some reason, even non-religious Jews have a Seder, right? Why? Because again, because that Seder mystically represents the membership of a Jew as a people, you see. It's very interesting that these are the only two mitzvahs you find that even many non-observant Jews also observe. Very interesting. So we now understand what God did is he gave a second tikkun device, a second device that can do the tikkun. And these are the mitzvahs that symbolically resemble or mirror the actual primary tikkun event, which is the actual exodus from Egypt. So therefore, this is how we remove, you see, the Zohama. Now, there's another way, is that we have to go through 4 exiles in order to remove the 4 environments of evil. And that's why we failed to do it in Egypt because of the golden calf. So we have to go through 4 more exiles, right, to remove those 4 ideas, right? First one was Babylon. Second one is Persia. The third one is Greece. And the fourth one is Rome. And that's the secret of the 4 exiles, that we have to duplicate, right, those 4 environments of evil. So we have to go through all 4, because Egypt itself represented all 4 exiles. So what you could do in Egypt, you can't do in the countries. Each one has its own environment, without getting into that, of what the Jews have to go through. And if they suffer or they do mitzvahs, then they reduce that environment of evil. And that's the secret of the 4 exiles, you see, that the Jews have to go through, which is really, in many ways, very interesting, you see. So this is a secondary tikkun device, you see. And what is also interesting is that these 4 cups also represent the 5 expressions of redemption that is used, that God took out. V'hitzalti, and I will rescue them. V'hitzesi, and I will take them out. V'lokachti, I will take them. V'goalti, and I will redeem them. And then v'hevesi, and I will bring them. You see, that's very interesting because these 4 represent, like I say, the 4 ideas of taking them out of the klipa, the 4 ideas, right? And then the 5th expression of redemption, right, is the actual removal of the Zohama and the actual removal of the barrier of the Geshem, you see. And when you think about it, these are replicated in Nitzavim. Remember I once told you where it says, and even if your outcast be at the ends of heaven, it has 3 ideas. Yikabetzcha, he will gather you, which is equivalent, right, to, and I will rescue you, and I will take you out. So then, which is v'yitzalti and v'yitzesi. The second idea, the other expression of the language of redemption, v'lokachti, and I will take you, is equivalent where it says umishom yikochecho, and God will take you out, right? So that's the v'lokachto of the 5 languages, expressions of redemption, right? And the last one, and also v'goalti, and the last one where it says, and God will take you to Eretz Yisrael, that's v'hevesi. See, that's the expression, and I will bring you. Actually, this is, when you think about it, the sequence of redemption. 1, God will separate us from the Goyim. He will separate all the Jews from the Goyim. That's the first. The second is that he will then take us to him, which means in some way which we do not know, he will teach us the Torah. All the Jews will again become Talmidei Chachomim. And I once mentioned how that could be, and so on, with the concept of Mishnayos. Because it says that, I mentioned that it says in the Medrash, where it says there that God will take that the only way the Jews can be redeemed is through the merit of learning Mishnayos, which is interesting. And that's the equivalent of lekachti, I will take them to me, which means I will teach them the Torah. And then, of course, the last way is vehevesi, and I will bring them to Eretz Yisrael, where, of course, where you will have the Beis HaMikdash. In any case, we have now covered, the whole idea of the tikkun process from the beginning to the end, and we now understand that the whole exile of Egypt, the whole redemption from Egypt, the giving of the Torah, and the restoration of the Zohama, all of this is the model of the actual redemption itself. And that's ultimately what is going to happen. It's a repeat, exactly what happened then. And we do that, we get rid of the Zohama, like I said, through the Torah itself, which can remove the Zohama, and also by being exiled through 4 nations, right? And the last way, of course, is by actually having a Seder and replicating or observing mitzvahs which represent the actual historical event of Egypt itself. Any questions?
So now that Shavuos it's on its way, what is the mindset we should be in to accept the holiday and then to
Well, the main idea of Shavuos, obviously, is to rejoice in the fact that we receive the Torah, which is the vehicle to bring the redemption. And the second thing is to reconfirm our desire to observe the Torah. Those are the two main ideas. To accept the Torah that we have, and we have to recognize that this is the only way to redeem ourselves, to get rid of the Zohama, and to enter the messianic era. So that's number one, to be joyful at receiving the Torah. That's one of the reasons why we stay up all night, because out of a sense of joy, we don't want to go to sleep, in anticipation of what we're about to get the next day. And the second idea is to, recommit to observing the Torah as best we can. Okay.
So every year, we redo the Omer because we're counting up as much as we did the Zohama.
Right.
Great. So now that we're not doing that, technically, we're really not ridding ourselves. We're still counting, but we're not ridding it. Or do we?
No, we do. Each year.
Is there something?
Each year we do something. We don't know how much, but every year that we observe these commandments of Pesach, including the Sphere Sa'omer and Shavuos, we diminish the Zohama. And the time will come when we will have observed, in many ways, the last Pesach. We will actually have vanquished the Zohama. We don't know when that is. But Pesach is what's called a secondary tikkun event, or I should say the Mitzvos of Pesach is a secondary tikkun event, you see. So there is a diminishment every Pesach. Let's hope that this one is it.
As we diminish the Zohama,
yes,
the Sefirot get re-energized?
Say that again. As we what?
As we diminish the Zohama within us, do the
yes.
Sefirot get re-energized?
Yes. Yes, but they're not released. There's two processes. One is that the sparks of holiness goes back into the spheres, and the second thing is that they're able to release it. So, that first process is always happening, where it's being restored to the spheres, but only during the Pekidah can it be released, and the Zechira, which is what Ramchal talks about in the Maimah HaGeula.
Which we're still waiting for the Pekidah, or do you think we're in the process of it?
Well, I would imagine that that we are right up against it. That it hasn't happened. Let's say the precursor seems to be happening, because evil is falling in America. And America's going to have a tremendous backlash against the Democratic Party and the liberals that are destroying America. So that's a very good sign. And also the Erev Rav in Israel is also experiencing a very strong possibility of collapse. So that has to mean that evil is on its way out. But it's still getting its last claim, you see. Same thing in Egypt, which I mentioned. That's because God has to balance the books before he brings the redemption. And that's why when Moshe Rabbeinu came, Paro all of a sudden issued a decree that they have to gather their own straw. You see. Because there's a claim that evil has, or I should say justice has. And I think we are in that period of time. So, whether if it could be before the Pekidah, but it seems to be before the Pekidah, or right up to that spot.
Remind me, what happens when the Pekidah happens?
Well, when the Pekidah happens, then the Yechidah is released. and crowns the Mashiach ben Yosef. And then he begins to grow. That's what happens. Because he is released from his own prison, the prison of the Zohama. You see, that's the Pekida. And that was the same idea by Moshe Rabbeinu, where it says, and God remembered the Jews, right before the sneh, the burning bush. You see. So the Pekida is when the Yechida, or the Mashiach himself, realizes that he's the Mashiach. And he is released, so he can begin his growth, which takes time, because he's been, enwrapped and imprisoned for so many years and so much suffering. And then the Zechira is when the Shechina is released, you see. And that's the equivalent of the 10 Makkos, where the Shechina is released, which is the actual energy of the spheres. And that's really the end. That's the Yikabetzcha. And God will gather you and bring you to him, and then bring you to Eretz Yisrael. So you have those two stages. Stage one is where the Mashiach himself is released, and and he gets that, the Yechida, that part of the Neshama of Adam Rishon, he gets that, so he can now begin to grow, as I quoted the Pasuk, Hine Yaskel Avdi, behold, my servant will grow wise, V'yorm v'nisa v'gova meyoid, and he will become exceedingly great. So the Yaskel Avdi is the Pekida, you see. And then after he grows, and while he grows, Klal Yisrael will also grow, and then you have the Zechira, which is the actual, in a certain sense, the destruction of the actual evil. Well, they will be destroyed, or whatever einish they get, and so on, So those are the two stages.
The Zechira is the Mashiach ben David?
The Zechira is the Mashiach ben David, yes.
And does it say anywhere a time frame between the two stages, or no?
Does it say what?
Does it say anywhere a time frame between the two stages?
To my knowledge, no, but it's not a long time period. It's not a long time period. And the main idea is Mashiach ben Yosef. Because his task, right, is to neutralize completely evil, the Erev Rav, right, and to bring down the Beis HaMikdash. After that, what else? Then that's it. That's the end. You see. So even though there's no release yet, it's like Moshe Rabbeinu coming to Egypt. There was a certain amount of months where they had to do the suffering, but once that was over, that's it. And the Rebbe Hashem destroyed them with the 10 Makkos. You see, and then they left Egypt, and so on. So that's also what's going to happen. There's a certain amount of time that the Mashiach ben Yosef has to do his job, but those tasks that he does is astounding. Because, like I say, it's teaching them Torah. It's also, besides teaching them Torah, it's also destroying evil and bringing down the Beis HaMikdash and beginning to reveal the Or Rishon, the messianic light. That's Mashiach ben Yosef. Mashiach ben David is what's called, he's the king that will, carry on a kingdom. That you have these 4 items. These items, the end of the Golus, all of them, the Beis HaMikdash, the Or Rishon, and so on, the end of the Exile, and so on. These items will be permanent in the Mashiach ben David. But the one who creates the change is Mashiach ben Yosef. You can look at it in terms of a woman giving birth. The one who takes the baby where it exits, and then all of a sudden it's now in the world, Mashiach ben Yosef, like he's the obstetrician, And then the one who grows the Mashiach the child, is Mashiach ben David. That's the kingdom of the Messiah. You see, the kingdom itself. But the transition of the evil kingdom to a messianic kingdom is Mashiach ben Yosef.
So wouldn't the 10 Makkot have to happen like during the process when the Beit HaMikdash comes down?
Yeah. It would probably happen then, right.
But you said that the Zechirah is when the Shekhinah is going to be revealed, and that's when the 10 Makkot happen.
Yeah, but that's going to be, what happens is that the Beis HaMikdash is revealed before Mashiach ben David. So maybe the Makkos will begin, well, the Makkos actually is during Mashiach ben Yosef. Actually, it's really an overlap. It's ben Yosef and ben David, you know. Doesn't really clearly say, like the Rambam says, we don't really know exactly what will happen. You know, we know different events will happen, but the actual sequence, we don't really know until they happen. That's what the Rambam says, you know. So we can more or less guess what seems to be the logical order of the sequence, but it could vary, you know. It could vary.
Didn't Rav say that some of the stages could happen even simultaneously?
Yeah, it could. You know, unless one is a prerequisite for the other. But that is a possibility, yes. But it's more likely that it will be a sequence.
So the time of when Mashiach ben Yosef has to grow, what is the world going to be looking like? Is evil still going to be on a high while he is growing himself?
Well, you're looking at the war of Gog and Magog, really, you know. When Mashiach ben Yosef grows, he will be totally successful. Nothing will be able to stop him, because that's what Mashiach ben Yosef is all about. It's an absolute success rate, you see. And the world will realize that the world is changing. And then you will have a reassertion of evil. That's the whole concept of Gog and Magog against Mashiach ben Yosef. That's really what happens. So there will be an attempt of evil, you know, right, to recapture or to reassert itself, its sovereignty. See, that's exactly what happened in Egypt. When the Jews left, all of a sudden Egypt ran after them. They wanted to reassert their dominance and sovereignty over the Jewish people. That was a second attempt. That is the equivalent of Gog from the land of Magog. So that is part of the process, yes, where evil is not just going to give up, you know. And then Mashiach ben David appears and wipes them out. And all of that is in Yecheskel, Lamed Ches, Sefer Yecheskel, Lamed Ches. That's all part of Mashiach ben Yosef's era, except at the end where Mashiach ben David appears and wipes them out.